I want to turn to somebody who's been incredibly vocal about the president's behavior this week. Senator Brian Schatz, Democrat of Hawaii, joins me now from Honolulu. Senator, welcome.
Thanks, Joy. Thanks for having me.
So after Charlottesville, you essentially said this is not your president, that Donald Trump is unfit for office. It's not something we hadn't heard before. With Bannon gone, does that change your view?
No, it really doesn't. And there was a fascinating panel about what happens next with Steve Bannon. And he is obviously an outsized character, a grandiose character, and a dangerous person to have proximity to that much authority. But in the end, the failures of this presidency are the president's failures. And what happened in the wake of Charlottesville was a perfect example of that. What we saw was that, by all accounts, the president had a script that he was supposed to read where he met the basic moral test of being the leader of the free world, which is to say that he knows the difference between Nazis and people who protest against Nazis, and he's the one that went off script. So as dangerous as Steve Bannon is, and as thankful as many of us are that he's leaving the White House, I think the real problem is the President of the United States, and that's not going to change anytime soon.
And I want to put up the tweet that you put up on Tuesday. This is the day after Donald Trump's unprecedented press conference where he supported the white nationalist marchers. And you wrote, "As a Jew, as an American, as a human, words cannot express my disgust and disappointment. This is not my president." Bannon has signaled he's going after, quote, the globalists. That usually has a very loaded meaning when people, especially at Breitbart, use that term. Do you believe that Jewish members of this cabinet should resign in protest, particularly given that Breitbart is signaling they're coming for them?
Yes, I think they have to. I think people of conscience can't pretend that this president is something that they had hoped he would be, that they were hoping that he would be competent, that he would be a deal maker in the middle, that he would be a pragmatist. I remember reading an article online at the very beginning of the presidency that he was going to function as sort of an executive chairman and allow each one of his cabinet officials to run the government as they see fit. None of that happened. And his ability to make deals, his ability to be a pragmatist, his ability to be a competent leader for the United States, none of it came through. And so what I thought was really hopeful over the last few days is that there are Republicans who are patriots who are finally standing up and saying enough is enough. Mitt Romney, both Presidents Bush, many of the leaders of the service branches of the Department of Defense, and finally, some of my Senate colleagues on the Republican side, whom I've been relatively critical of for not doing enough, they said some pretty harsh things. And I think that this is the beginning of the end of Republicans being able to hide behind some imaginary Donald Trump that clearly doesn't exist anymore. This person is not capable morally, politically, or in terms of his competencies to lead the free world.
But notably not on that list of people who've stood up to Donald Trump in the wake of this the Monday press conference are Mitch McConnell, who issued a statement much later and some private concerns, and over on the House side, Paul Ryan. Without their leadership, do you expect your colleagues on the other side of the aisle to have the courage to stand up to him more than with words?
I think there's a groundswell, and I imagine that the Majority Leader McConnell and Speaker Ryan will be among the last to turn. But I think, one of the things that was exciting for the country in the last week of the work period was John McCain's no vote, where we rejected what they were trying to do with ACA, but also a 98-2 vote for tough Russia sanctions, which obviously the president was trying to stop all the way through.
Yeah.
So even in that week, and add to that Jeff Flake's very sharp comments that week, you had the beginning of the mouse that is the legislative branch starting to roar.
Yeah.
I don't want to overstate this because I think we have a long way to go, but I was encouraged by Republican patriots, people with whom I disagree on almost everything when it comes to policy, but who are moral and decent human beings who want to do the right thing by the country, who say, look, I have very few bright lines, but understanding the difference between Nazis and the people who oppose Nazis is one of those bright lines. And I think we're going to see more of that rather than less through the fall.
Yeah, you would think. Senator Brian Schatz, thank you very much for your time tonight.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.